Hello, and welcome to another episode of David's Divergent Discussions. I'm your host, David Gray Hammond, and today I'm here with Ryan from Stimpunks, and we're going to be talking about Cavendish spaces, niche construction. We might get a little bit of the idea I've talked about, a bit of nesting in there. Um, so, without further ado, we'll do our audio descriptions. So, I'm David Gray Hammond. I'm a white presenting male in his mid 30s. I have a shaved head and a beard. I'm wearing thick rimmed purpley grey glasses. I have a lip piercing and an ear tunnel. I'm sat in a darkening blue room because it's getting away from summer now in the UK. And I'm next to the famous bookcase that still hasn't fallen on me. Um, Ryan, would you mind introducing yourself and giving a brief audio description?
Sure, I'm Ryan Boren. I'm a 49-year-old white man with brown hair, brown beard, and brown glasses and a light brown shirt. And I'm wearing a lanyard that's got my sensory kit and other coping stuff on it. And someone just pulled up in a car, so pardon that background noise. I'm sitting on my front porch, and it's a nice, fairly cool day with the live oaks looking great.
Fantastic. So, Ryan, for people who might not have come across you before, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your involvement with neurodiversity and neurodivergent people?
Yeah, I think like many people, many adults who were late diagnosed, I kind of came to it through my kids when they got their diagnosis as part of attending school. And then you do the family history as part of that, and you realize how many traits you have, and start to identify with autism and neurodivergence in yourself. And the diagnosis process with the kids turned into one for me and my spouse. And then we had the now 17-year inclusion fight to get our family included in education, healthcare, and our systems. And so that all I'm on line, and that all led to excuse me. That all led to really Stimpunks came out of our family's struggle to be included and survive. And I'll leave it at that and kick it back to you.
Fantastic. Well, today we're going to be talking about some concepts that can be found on the Stimpunks website, stimpunks.org. And I'm really excited about this because, as I said to you before we went live, I have that real. I like to reclaim the word neurofuturism from the AI brigade because I think there's more to futurism than AI. And some of the ideas we're going to talk about this evening, or I guess this afternoon for you, they really scratch that itch for me. So there's a couple of terms people might not have heard. So we're gonna go through some of a couple of them and sort of just set the ground for what we're going to be talking about. So first of all, when people talk about Cavendish spaces, what is meant by that?
So our working definition of Cavendish space is psychologically and sensory safe spaces suited to zone work, flow states, intermittent collaboration, and collaborative niche construction, which is a mouthful of new terminology, but that's our concise attempt at saying what Cavendish space is. And Cavendish space kind of was born from reading Neurotribes, which is another important part of our journey, discovering Neurotribes and all the stuff it opened up for us. But it opens with the tale of Henry Cavendish, who was one of the first scientists in the modern sense. He's the discoverer of hydrogen, and he's discussed in Neurotribes as an example of an autistic person who went undiagnosed in his life, but has all kinds of traits that I related to. And he he was, I think, the richest man in England at the time. He inherited two fortunes. And so, despite him being very odd and out of place with his Royal Society members, he was afforded space because he was rich nobility. And our notion of Cavendish space is to give the privileges afforded to Cavendish himself to all of the people who come to Stimpunks for our learning spaces and events and such. And so, kind of rambling. I'll kick it back to you for questions.
So with the Cavendish space, we're really talking about that space where you can get into that monotropic flow state, I guess.
Yes.
It's well suited to that. But what might Cavendish space look like in a practical sense? What sort of things have you seen it as in practice?
Well, we've combined it with a notion from contemporary progressive education called caves, campfires, and watering holes. They're, they're archetypal learning spaces that have kind of been with humanity a long time, and we keep recreating them in various ways. We recreate them online in the ways we communicate. And what stood out in the tale of Cavendish and Neurotribes to me is that he had caves, campfires, and watering holes. He had his cave, his estate, his home, where he could do his meticulous experiments and be alone and be in his own head. And then he had a small group of people at the Royal Society that he would kind of hang on the edges of. He was known as a wallflower, and that when you talked to him, you wouldn't look him straight in the eye. You had to look to the side of him, and he didn't say a lot, but when he did, he was quite astounding. And then he had the watering hole, which is kind of his exposure to the Royal Society at large, but also just science and thought at the time. He had a friend who helped him uh, kind of handle the more public stuff, and all that I related to highly, and related to what I've done building open source communities. And so caves, campfires, and watering holes is a very important part of Cavendish space. And it's a very important part of intermittent collaboration, which is another glossary term. We have a glossary on our website that's got hundreds of entries and includes everything we're going to be talking about today.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so intermittent collaboration is um, it's pretty self-describing there. When you're moving in between your caves, campfires, and watering holes, your collaboration is intermittent. So you go to the campfire in Cavendish's example. It's a small group of Royal Society members he hung out with, and that's where he bounced ideals off of other people in a way that was psychologically safe for him, because he had the understanding of his peers and who kind of adapted to his ways. And so he had his cave at home, he had his Royal Society um, group, and so he had intermittent collaboration with others, and then he could go back and synthesize everything he learned in that collaboration in his cave. And so those zones are, I just, looking back on my life and career, the caves, campfires, and watering holes resonates so much with me, and how I cope and how I work and how I build niches. And I'll, excuse me, I'm having a cramp. I have a neuromuscular disease, so I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. Well, I would certainly. I like the idea of the cave particularly because, as I've written about myself on my blog, um, I have found that I engage in what I call nesting, which I guess could be considered the construction of that cave environment where you can come and have that solitary space to process and synthesize the information that you've acquired from your intermittent collaboration. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to that intermittent collaboration as well in the neurodiversity community, because we have, for example, I know that you and I largely met through the Discord server that I run. And, you know, the Discord server for me is kind of like my watering hole. It's sort of a loosely structured space where people can come and go and sort of just casually share. You know, there's no formalization in there. And I certainly, I think a lot of us also, you know, can relate to the campfire, that coming and learning from the elders of the community, because we have events like this where we have live streams and presentations and conferences where you see some of the names that are really strongly associated with the neurodiversity movement. And so you can really start to see how these concepts are already sort of weaved into the neurodiversity movement, but perhaps we need to expand upon them more, because when it comes to what I want to move on to, niche construction, it's really important that we create these environments where autistic people can thrive, rather than expecting them to adapt to an environment that perhaps isn't best suited for them. And so, yeah, niche construction. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, where does it come from? Where does the idea come from, and how can we apply it to, you know, the autistic learner?
Yeah, I'll go to our niche construction glossary page real quick and just read you a few short definitions that cover different contexts. So one is positive niche construction, the practice of differentiating instruction for the neurodiverse brain. That's quoted from this piece called Neurodiversity in the Classroom. That was kind of part of my journey into discovering caves, campfires, and watering holes with niche construction. And here's another definition. Positive niche construction is a strengths-based approach to educating students with disabilities. And that's kind of, in the US, we have this thing called least restrictive environment that comes from our laws, our IDEA Act, and that's Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, if I recall the correct acronym expansion. But the least restrictive environment is, it's a nice intention, but it tends being used in deficit ideology ways. And so niche construction is kind of a strengths-based uh, approach that differentiates from least restrictive environment. And this niche construction originally comes from like evolutionary biology, and in nature, it's niche construction is helping to ensure the thriving of an organism by directly modifying the environment in such a way that enhances that organism's chances for survival. And in culture, niche construction is helping to ensure the thriving of a child or any person by directly modifying the environment in such a way that enhances chances for success. And that's the definitional gist of where niche construction came into my life. It was both the from a contemporary progressive education point, but also an evolutionary biology standpoint. And then a person who's talked about this quite a bit is Jorn Betten of the Autistic Collaboration Trust. And they have a book out called The Beauty of Collaboration at Human Scale, Timeless Patterns of Human Limitations. Excuse me. And I love that book. There's so much to learn about rhizomatic thinking and organizing, something I know you're interested in. But to get back to niche construction, I'm going to quote from The Beauty of Collaboration at Human Scale. Collaborative niche construction allows organizations and people to participate in the evolution of living systems and results in resilient social ecosystems. And to me, that's part of what we're trying to build with the autistic rhizome. And I think the whole thing's kind of a act of niche construction.
Yeah, and I think people might not realize that niche construction, it's actually been fairly important to humanity for a while, because from an evolutionary standpoint, we have been adapting our environment to our strengths. for a very long time. That's what we do with our technology. We adapt the environment to meet so that we can thrive. Um, and I think from an educational standpoint, that's really important because a lot of, you know, I remember being an autistic kid in school, and it was very much you do this our way or you don't do it at all. So what actually happened was I did not thrive in the educational environment I was in. And I developed a lot of school trauma. I developed a lot of, um, well, actually, I didn't develop a lot besides school trauma, to be honest. I came out of high school with little qualifications to my name. And it wasn't really till I entered university and was able to engage with more self-directed learning that I started to do better. Um, but I think it, it's good that we can have these conversations because part of building that resilience as a social ecosystem is is being able to adapt the environment because the world is not designed for autistic people. Um, so could you tell me a bit more about Stimpunk's work in this area, and maybe, what you're hoping to achieve?
Sure. We have four pillars, as we call them, that we work on. And one of them is a learning space that incorporates all of our ideas about Cavendish space, caves, campfires, and watering holes, dandelion, tulips, and orchids, which is another thing that kind of fits in, and niche construction, and everything we've talked about so far, we try to roll into our learning space. And if you go to stimpunks.org/space, um, you can see the current activities we got going on, and also just a deep dive on our philosophy and our pedagogy, and we try to be really syncretic and bring things together from an interdisciplinary menagerie of influences. I've mentioned contemporary progressive education several times. We hang out with a lot of teachers, and we've adapted the best of that to fit with what we know with neurodiversity, to fit with what I've known developing open source communities and companies. And I'm kind of losing the thread here. I've started to ramble. I go down a rabbit hole and then I forget how to go back one.
I do exactly the same, but I was thinking just then about the fact that all of these concepts are very much interrelated, which, as someone who enjoys sort of rhizomatic ideas, pleases me because to do that niche construction, you need your campfires, your watering holes, your caves. You need all of these spaces because we need to be learning from each other in order to understand the nature of our own neurodivergence and therefore know how to best adapt the environment, to facilitate that niche construction. And I think that's really where the spaces where autistic people can come together and share their experience are very important because the contemporary education has told us that education is about learning from an expert, but it's very restrictive on who that expert is. And I think, that's why it's really important we have the watering hole space because actually every autistic person is an expert in their own autistic experience. And so to truly adapt an environment and create a social ecosystem we can thrive in, we have to have the input of all of those people with their lived experience and on the understanding that we're not all going to agree with each other because we all have different experiences. even even if we have experienced the same two events, we are going to have fundamentally different interpretations of them. So I think that's where, for me, I find the watering hole space a really important space because yes, you can do a lot of learning from the experts, from the elders of your community, but it's the people on the ground who, the everyday person that you can casually come to and come away from to process that information. It's that average person who is going to put that expert knowledge into context for you. We do have a question, which I wonder if you could answer. Maddie, Black Lives Matter, wanted to know, how do you change NT neurotypical teachers' minds with your program? So, how would you approach um, a neurotypical teacher, for example, and attempt to, if you were trying to espouse the benefits here, what is it you would say to them?
Um, if I was talking to someone in U.S. education, I might start by talking about least restrictive environment because it's something we know, and talking about how that's kind of a limited accommodation and deficit based viewpoint, and maybe try to use that to bootstrap into the niche construction aspect. Because we have met some teachers along the way, and I can't say I'm good at convincing anyone of anything, but we've had some teachers along the way who, even before we had the vocabulary for niche construction to offer them, we're finding ways in their classrooms to let kids differentiate for themselves. And if I was trying to convince someone, I think I would mention some of the teachers I know who like put couches in their classrooms and saw their neurodivergent students thrive when they were offered choice and a little say in what their environment looks like. I like zero-based design as advocated by timeless learning, which is one of the fundamental texts of progressive pedagogy. And I know teachers pride themselves on their rooms, but I would encourage them to start with more of a blank slate at the beginning of the year and let the students differentiate and define that space for you and see what they come up with. Anyway, I'm straying from the initial question, but I think I in the past I've started by talking about least restrictive environment, talking about something that people know, and then getting them to niche construction. But oftentimes, what we bump up against is there's just no space to create a niche of any sort anywhere
Mm.
in their systems, in their environments. There's no flexibility at all. And we've talked about things like you can do things like putting a shower curtain on a hula hoop and at least giving a kid a cave to get back to our cave campfires and watering holes. And there's some stuff like that that we've recommended. Oh my God, there's a good book by an autistic author who's done this professionally in schools, done from the little hacks for defining caves, campfires, and watering holes to bigger design projects. I can't remember the name of the book, unfortunately. It'll come to me. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I'd at least try to start. But I can't claim success with a lot of success with
Well,
convincing people to change. That's why one reason we're just doing it ourselves. We're rolling our own
yeah.
because there isn't that flexibility oftentimes. And so you have to be a model. You have to be an exemplar by going off and doing your own thing if you can. So that's kind of where we're at.
See, for me, and perhaps this would be different for another autistic person, but for me, the perfect learning environment would have all three archetypal environments in it. You would have the campfire space, you would have the watering hole space, you would have the cave space, and the student can choose which of those spaces they want to use at any moment. They can enter into any of those spaces as a starting point. It's led by them. But I know that in the work I do a very sort of person-led approach. When I work with mentoring students, I'm led by their needs, by what they want to do. So they use their time with me in whatever way they see fit. Um, and I wonder sometimes if the classroom could really benefit from something like that, where you have the various spaces on offer and the student chooses the space that best suits them in the moment. Because I think there is far too much emphasis put on the learning from the expert. It can be very limited. And I wonder, have you come across any spaces where the student has the choice of how they engage, or is this still something that needs to be built towards?
There are people building it on small scales, at least. One near us in Austin, Texas, USA, is a Broom, and they're very much student directed, student led, passion based, human centered, progressive. Uh, they they really do it in a way compatible. And there's this book called Trust Kids, and Antonio Bueller, who runs a Broom, has a essay in Trust Kids, and he talks about how they got one kid and came in, and he would immediately just go in the closet and spend most of his day there. And they were concerned. They didn't know his motivations and whatnot, but they took their time with him, and they realized that he just preferred it in there. He needed that he needed that cave, literal sort of cave, to be able to regulate. And they talked about how he had such a hard time at his previous school, and how he was declared manageable and unteachable and all these other things. But they just let him spend time in the closet and regulate, and that did wonders for him. So that's a little anecdote from that book, Trust Kids, which I recommend to everyone. There's other examples of progressive pedagogy in practice in that book.
Fantastic. And we have another question. I'm not 100% sure on how to answer it, but Patricia asks, how do you teach the teachers with regards to autistic children being brought up within families of other cultures?
Oh, I'm gonna have to think about that one. Um, that's a that's a um, yeah. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Maybe that's a question that people can keep an eye on the Stimpunks website for a blog post or something.
Yeah, that's a good idea, because the bringing the multiple cultures in, I'm thinking apart how, there are so many teachers and parents who are not politically or socially connected to the neurodiversity movement or the disability rights movement at all. And that's one cultural gap that is one I try to bridge with with teachers. Again, I don't know how effectively, but yeah, just getting people politically and socially connected with the neurodiversity and disability rights movements is a big culture bridge for me. But then we get into cultures outside my own. I'm a white man in Texas, so I need to be careful of my lanes here. But yeah, um,
But yeah, I think it comes down to the double empathy problem as well, doesn't it? With working with children who are in families of other cultures, because I mean, we think about the double empathy problem from the perspective of um, autistic to non-autistic communication, but there is the double empathy divide exists for various cultures. So whenever you're trying to bridge cultures, you have to bear in mind that that difference in experience is going to make it difficult to ever fully empathize. Now, that's not to say that you can't ever empathize, but you will never be able to understand the experience of that culture through the lived experience because you are not a part of that culture. So I guess perhaps something that needs to be addressed in any kind of niche construction is that it does have to be, as you've said, collaborative, doesn't it? Because you know if the teacher is the one trying to adapt the environment, it's going to fundamentally miss the point in which it should be suitable for all the children to thrive, which that
yeah,
teacher's never going to be able to hit every environmental need that is required, Um,
yeah. I think a good rule for navigating culture is the disability and neurodiversity rights slogan, "Nothing about us without us." Because I think when we always keep that in mind, We're letting people speak for themselves, crossing the double empathy gap on their own terms, and and you just get the most authentic answers and solutions when you always keep that in mind.
Okay. Well, let me just check my notes over here. So I think we were also going to talk a bit about the concept of dandelions, tulips, and orchids.
Yeah. That's
So would you like to explain that a little bit? Because that could sound quite random to anyone who doesn't have the notes in front of
yeah,
them.
it's a way of talking about low sensitive, medium sensitive, and high sensitive people, with orchids being the high sensitive. And I like to, since I have this glossary, I like to use it. So let me get what I queued up here for. So people differ substantially in their reactivity or sensitivity to environmental influences, with some being generally more effective than others. And so this wasn't written with that's a definition from translational psychiatry about dandelions, tulips, and orchids, and that a lot of this is written with neurodiversity or autism in mind. But I related to it so strongly that I integrated it in with like the stress model of autism, which comes from peripheral minds, and also with caves, campfires, and watering holes, and attention capital theory. I integrated into that, and one thing it's often confused with, uh, well, it's a way of talking about differential susceptibility, and you might have heard about the highly sensitive person. That was very popular for a while, and there's a lot of similarities to dandelions, tulips, and orchids, but the high sensitive person doesn't map as well as the differential susceptibility hypothesis, which is another way of talking about orchid dandelion hypothesis. And the differential susceptibility hypothesis is much more researched than the highly sensitive person one. So if you've heard of highly sensitive person, you're like, is that the same thing as what I'm talking about with the orchids? And the answer is kind of yes and no. There are similarities, but I found that the differential susceptibility hypothesis, also known as orchids from now on, better fits all the stuff I've been advocating with caves, campfires, and watering holes and such. And I've rambled enough. I'll turn it to you.
What I like about the dandelions, tulips, and orchids idea is that it allows, to me, from my reading of it, it allows for that dynamic nature of autistic experience, or neurodivergent experience. So, there will be days where perhaps we are more orchid-like and we're going to be extremely sensitive to our environment. There are going to be days when we're more tulip-like. There are going to be days when we're more dandelion-like, and there might be an overall average to where we fall on that scale, but it's not restrictive, because I know one of the criticisms I've heard of the highly sensitive person thing is that really it's just a euphemism for a neurodivergent person. And
Yeah, exactly.
but the dandelions, tulips, and orchids idea, to me, it has a bit more of a dynamic approach in my understanding of it, and it takes into account the fact that what we can tolerate one day, we might not be able to tolerate the next. And I think that, again, it links back in, because when you are constructing the niche, when you're designing your campfires, your caves, your watering holes, when you're creating that Cavendish space where a person can get into their flow state, it's got to be a dynamic space, because you're going to be a different person each time you come back to your space. Um, and I think that's something really important to take account of, because I think one of the most restrictive issues we have when it comes to educational spaces is that they assume that the person coming to that educational space is going to be the same person as it was every other day. And that's just not how people engage with the world. I know in my own concept of the chaotic self that I've written about, I talk about the fact that the self that lies underneath all the various layers of identity, it's constantly shifting and moving. Each interaction with the environment, with the social ecosystem, with people and individuals, every interaction changes us a little bit. So I feel that any space that is going to be accessed by a person, neurodivergent or not, needs to acknowledge that that person is going to change from day to day. Um, and I think that's something that gets left out of the conversation far too often. Um, is there anything you wanted to talk about this evening that we haven't covered?
Oh, let me see. Um, I had some other stuff we hit intermittent collaboration. Do we talk about monotropism and flow very much?
I mean, I think we probably could cover monotropism and flow. They're always good subjects to get into.
Yeah. Um, yeah, for me to be self-determined, I need to be able to construct niches and achieve flow states. And if I'm bound in such a way that I can't do either of those things, I'm not going to thrive. I'm uh, I'm going to be anxious, and I'm not going to have an outlet, and I'm going to be bound up. And so achieving flow states is such an important thing to me, and so therapeutic, and it helps me cope in so many ways that it makes niche construction all the more important, because to achieve flow states, I really need all these things we've talked about.
Hmm.
I need a cave, campfire, and watering home for various stages of my work. I need I need all my assistive devices. I have a neuromuscular disease. Part of my halting speech and distracted speaking is because I'm constantly cramping. I'm constantly spasming. So if someone noticed that, yeah, I have torso cramps that make it hard to talk and breathe. And anyway, to build a niche for this chronically ill body um, is very important to helping me cope and achieve flow states, and to be able to do any of the stuff I do at Stimpunks. I need to be able to achieve flow states to uh, to be productive and keep going. And niche construction and nesting help me immensely with that.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the common misunderstandings when it comes to monotropism, because people understand that monotropism explains hyperfocus, which is what you and I might call a flow state. So we're at that point where we are singularly driven on a particular task, and we've sort of blocked out the external demands to focus on that singular point. And that flow state obviously is beneficial to the autistic person, or ADHD has also been associated with monotropism. But um, it's not as simple as just I'm going to hyperfocus now. You need the right space, you need the right environment, you need the right supports, because as I've mentioned, we live in a world that is not designed for us. So it's not designed to help us achieve that flow state, which is really where the niche construction comes in, isn't it? It's 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 going beyond survival of the fittest and creating environments where people can thrive. We're moving away from that sort of social Darwinism where it's do things via the neuronormative standard or fail to thrive. It's moving into a world where everyone can have their space to enter that flow state, to have the benefits of that flow state. And I wonder, what do you think, if teachers were watching this live stream this evening or this afternoon, as it is for you, um, what would you say to them about providing a space where their neurodivergent class members can enter a flow state? What advice might you give them as a starting point?
Well, for me, nesting in niche construction also includes like my sensory kit. I've got mine hanging right here,
Yeah.
and we primarily need to change the environment, but we can also get our sensory kits to help us stand any environment. And I mentioned that because my sensory kit's such an active niche construction and nesting for me. It's nesting that's always on my body and helps me cope in all kinds of situations. So that's something I wish was easier in school to have your sensory kit and use it. So help kids with sensory kits. And I had a second part that was going to go beyond that, and now I'm blanking. Could you repeat the question?
Um, what would you say to teachers who want to help their students get into a flow state?
Okay, so sensory kits. Find some way to have a cave campfire and watering hole. I remember one of the best things my first grade teacher did for me was find me a little spot in the corner. And in some ways, it could be like, oh, they segregated the undiagnosed autistic kid in the corner, but that's the only place I could thrive, and only place I could read because exposure anxiety and situational mutism made it such that my teachers didn't know I could read for the beginning of my elementary school career because I couldn't talk to them. I couldn't read out loud until one day a teacher just kind of went off into the corner with me, got me comfortable and at my own desk and leaned into me and was like, could you read this? And I quietly whispered the whole book to her and kind of blew her away because not only could I read, I was hyperlexic as we found out later. And I couldn't express any of that because I never felt psychologically safe. And that's one reason why Cavendish space in the definition, one of the first things that we mentioned is psychological safety. So find places for psychological safety for your kids. Get them a sensory kit, get them psychologically safe. Because I was terrified my entire school career and overwhelmed by my senses, overwhelmed by the socialization. I needed my sensory kit, I needed a cave, and I didn't have either.
Yeah, and I think this also comes back to Tanya Adkins' idea of neurodivergent competence, because part of creating safety for neurodivergent students in the classroom is that the people who have any kind of authority in that classroom need to have some competence around working with neurodivergent students. It's no good to have just gone on like an autism awareness course or something. You need to have an understanding of the way that neurodivergent people relate to their environment, the way they use language, the way they understand the world around them. Because if you don't have that, it's difficult to achieve that psychological safety, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the term neuroception, which we've got a glossary page for it that'll explain this better than I can here. But it's kind of like your 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 awareness of danger, and I think a lot of us are hypervigilant. I'll mention meerkat mode, Tanya's meerkat mode. That hypervigilance that comes with heightened neuroception that many neurodivergent people have. And I remember one autistic person said the primary emotion for fraud, her primary emotion as an autistic person was fear, and I related to that so much because in school I was afraid. I never knew what was happening to me. I was overwhelmed in every sensory way. And so here's someone with heightened neuroception who's sensing things in the environment that other people don't notice. And I was just constantly in fear and anxiety. And so thinking getting to know about neuroception, I think, is another way to help students
Hmm.
achieve niche construction and psychological safety.
Absolutely. Well, there's a couple of comments. They're not questions, they're more comments that I just wanted to highlight before we wrap up because we're nearly at the end of our time. But most place the page highlights that humans' ability to adapt to the environment to themselves is a neurodiverse commonality and not restricted to neurodivergent. I like that because it's almost like humans' ability to adapt the environment to themselves. It crosses that double empathy divide. One thing we can all understand is a need to adapt the environment in order to thrive.
I agree with that, but I also want to add an addendum, and that existing on the margins forces you to invent. And so I think it's Liz Jackson, the disabled designer, who has lots of great talks if you ever get a chance to listen to them. Liz Jackson talks about how disabled people, the original life hackers, and that so many things were born in disability communities from disabled people, so much technology, and so it is a whole human neurodiverse thing, but existing on the margins forces you to hack and DIY, and so there's a difference there. I want to not get lost.
Yeah. And Maddie Black Lives Matter says everyone benefits from a neurodivergent environment, but not everyone thrives on a neurotypical one. I wish teachers would get that. Now, I wanted to highlight this because actually, didn't mean to do that. I find that this is pretty true, actually. Accommodations within the environment that help to adapt the environment to neurodivergent people often make everyone more comfortable because I find that there's often this argument of, well, if we give it to one, we have to give it to all of them. And my question is, why not give it to all of them? Like, because if it helps one, it might help everyone in some way, even if it doesn't help them in exactly the same way. But, you know, it's clear to me, and I'm interested to know your thoughts, but it's clear to me that this one size fits all approach that Western education has had for some time now, it it only works for a for a small subsection of students. And I guess my thoughts here are that actually, yeah, why not design the environment with the neurodivergent minority in mind? Because it does make it more comfortable for everyone. Because it's not just neurodivergent people who are going to benefit from niche construction, is it?
No, indeed, yeah. Everything we've talked about are tools that any human can use, and they're important tools to have in our schools, and we need to make room for them, one way or another. But unfortunately, we're going the opposite way with so much behaviorism, especially here in Texas and the U.S. It's big money, big industry, and it's everywhere in our school.
And as a final note, Maggie Wolfendale says, necessity, the mother of invention. And I think that's quite true.
Yep, exactly. If if we don't hack, we go without.
Yeah. So, Ryan, it's been fantastic speaking to you today. I've really enjoyed this. Are there any thoughts you wanted to close on, or?
I'll just plug our glossary one more time because it says it better than I can as I'm over here cramping and gasping for air. Stimpunks.org/glossary, and then / whatever term that you've heard here today will get you to a glossary page that we try to. Some of them can be pretty long because we're curating information from lots of sources and just kind of letting you rabbit hole on it. But we try to get a plain language description at the top, and then get more wonkier and more academic as you scroll down. So you can get the gist of the term at the top, and then if you want to go exploring, you can keep on scrolling down. And we put a lot of effort into our glossary, and go check it out.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. Later this week on Thursday, I will be live with Aim for the Rainbow for Bisexual Awareness Week. I think I got that right. As always, I never know what I've got coming up because I have the organization of a peanut, in that peanuts are not organized because they're not sentient. So, thank you very much to everyone, and I will catch you all on the next episode. So, thank you and goodbye.